The prairie stretched endless in every direction, dry grass shimmering like waves of gold beneath the merciless afternoon sun. The wind carried nothing but dust and the lonely cry of a hawk circling overhead. In the middle of it all sat a small ranch, its fences leaning tiredly, its barn patched with mismatched planks, and its house scarred by old bullet holes that told of battles long past. This was the world of Silas Kane, a man who had chosen silence as both punishment and refuge. At 48, Silas bore the kind of face the land carved into men-deep lines across his forehead, a jaw like weathered stone, and gray eyes dulled by years of sorrow. His wife and young boy had been killed nearly a decade ago in a border raid that blurred the line between soldiers and bandits. Since then, he had not sought friendship, nor laughter, nor even company. He worked his cattle, mended his fences, and spoke only to the wind, coyotes, and the ghosts that haunted his nights. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Silas would sit on the porch with a half-empty bottle, his rifle across his lap, listening to the emptiness around him. The silence had become both comfort and curse. It kept him safe, yet reminded him constantly of everything he had lost. But on one particular evening, the silence broke. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, rolling black and heavy, promising rain. The dry land had been denied for months. Silas leaned against the porch post, squinting at the sky. That was when he heard it. Hoofbeats, faint but steady, carried on the wind. His body went rigid. Hoofbeats out here never meant good news. Bandits, drifters, bounty hunters, soldiers, they all brought trouble. Silas reached for his rifle, checking the chamber with a practiced hand. His ranch had been left alone for years because everyone knew Silas Kane wasn't a man to trifle with. But that didn't mean trouble couldn't come knocking. The sound grew closer. He stepped off the porch, boots crunching on the dry earth, eyes narrowing as shadows moved in the distance. Then he saw them. Not soldiers, not outlaws, Apaches, 10 of them. They rode weary horses, their bodies slumped with exhaustion. 3 of the riders were women, one clutching a feverish child to her chest. 2 warriors bore visible wounds, their clothes stained with blood. The others, though tired, carried themselves with the alertness of men who expected attack at any moment. Silas froze, every muscle tensed. Memories rushed back, stories of raids, of neighbors slaughtered, of fear whispered across frontier towns. His own tragedy was still carved into his heart. And now, here they were, at his very gate. The lead rider urged his horse forward. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair tied back, his face solemn but unflinching. When he dismounted, his movements were slow, deliberate, respectful. He raised his hand, palm outward, and spoke in halting English. Shelter. One night his voice was deep, carrying both command and plea. His eyes, sharp as flint, locked with Silas's. 2 men, measuring one another, suspicion and pride hanging heavy between them. Silas gripped his rifle tighter. Why here? Why me? The last thing he wanted was strangers under his roof, much less those the world had branded as enemies. He looked past the leader, at the tired women and coughing children, at the wounded warrior clutching his side. They were human, but they were also danger. If soldiers found them here, Silas would hang for harboring them. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of the coming storm. Lightning flickered on the horizon, thunder rumbling low like distant drums of war. Silas's throat tightened. His instinct screamed to send them away, to shut the door and protect what little he had left. But another voice, quieter, older, buried, deep, whispered that he knew what it was to lose everything. The Apache leader's hand remained raised, unmoving, his expression unreadable. Behind him, one of the women shifted the fevered child in her arms. Whispering softly in her own tongue, Silas finally spoke, his voice rough from disuse. This is no place for you. Not here. The leader's jaw tightened, but he did not lower his hand. He simply repeated, softer this time, almost like a vow. One night the rancher's gray eyes flicked again to the child, then back to the proud warrior before him. He felt the storm closing in, pressing him toward a decision that could not be undone. For the first time in years, Silas Kane's silence broke not with a curse or a cry to ghost, but with a choice that might bring back all his pain, or change his life forever. He lowered his rifle. The storm finally broke. Rain lashed the dry earth, pounding the roof of Silas Kane's house like 1,000 drumbeats. Lightning split the sky, casting brief white fire across the prairie. The air smelled of wet dust and old fear. Inside the ranch house, the silence was worse than the storm. Silas sat in his worn chair near the hearth, rifle across his knees, his gray eyes fixed on the shadows that filled his home. 10 strangers had taken it over. Their presence unsettled every bone in his body. The leader, Nakai, crouched by the fire, his broad shoulders blocking the flickering glow. He warmed his hands as if he belonged there. His sister, Alina, slender and Stranad, knelt beside her feverish child, pressing a damp cloth against the boy's burning forehead. Another woman hummed softly to soothe the little ones, her voice carrying the rhythm of a language Silas didn't know, but somehow felt. 2 warriors sat apart, backs against the wall, their eyes sharp as knives in the dark. One of them, Kohana, never removed his gaze from Silas. Every movement of the rancher's hand, every shift of his weight, was watched. Kohana's hand never strayed far from the hilt of the knife strapped to his thigh. The storm outside was deafening. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of fire, the ragged breathing of the wounded, and the restless shifting of mistrust. Finally, Silas spoke, his voice gravelly. This house wasn't built for strangers. Nakai turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting Silas's without fear. Storm, soldiers, we had no choice. Silas's grip tightened on the rifle. He leaned forward, his voice low, almost dangerous. You always have a choice. You chose my land. My house. Alina lifted her head. Her English was clearer, though soft, almost pleading. We ask only shelter. Tomorrow, we go. Silas barked, a dry laugh. Tomorrow, and when soldiers follow your tracks right to my door, what then? You think they'll let me say I didn't know? No, they'll string me up beside you. The wounded warrior shifted, wincing. Kohana's eyes narrowed. He muttered something sharp in Apache, his voice dripping with suspicion. Nakai silenced him with a gesture, but Silas caught the tone, if not the words. What did he say? Silas demanded. Nakai's jaw tightened. After a pause, he answered simply. He says you do not want us here. That maybe you wait until we sleep. Then call soldiers. The words hit like a bullet. Silas rose to his feet, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. His voice thundered louder than the storm. If I wanted you dead, you'd be dead already. The firelight flashed across his hard face, his rifle steady in his grip. The Apaches didn't flinch, but tension gripped the room like a noose. Elena's child whimpered. She hushed him gently, then looked at Silas with eyes that held neither hatred nor fear, just exhaustion. You have ghosts here. I see it in your face. The words cut through him like a knife. Silas's mouth tightened, his gaze darting to the mantel where a faded photograph sought his wife and boy, forever smiling in a world that no longer existed. He swallowed hard. The storm's roar outside, masking the thud of his heart. He tried to hide his pain, but Elena pressed softly, her voice steady. They were taken from you. Silas didn't answer. His silence was enough. The room softened, if only for a moment. Even Nakai lowered his head slightly, as if acknowledging a wound that needed no translation. But the peace was fleeting. A knock rattled the front door. No, not a knock, a fist, pounding heavy against the wood. The Apaches stiffened instantly, hands to weapons. Silas's blood ran cold. He moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see through the rain. Torchlight, riders, soldiers, he cursed under his breath. Of all nights, of all storms. Nakai rose slowly, towering, ready to fight. But Silas raised a hand sharply. Stay where you are. If they see you, we're all finished. The pounding came again, louder, a voice shouting through the storm. Silas Kane, open up. Silas knew the voice. Marshal Curtis Hale, the Iron Marshal, a man who lived for law, but only the kind written in his own hand. Lightning flashed, and for a split second, Silas saw the eyes of the Apaches, wide and waiting. Trust or betrayal, his next words would decide everything. He gripped the door handle, heart hammering like a war drum. The knock at the door faded into silence, but the echo of it stayed in Silas Kane's bones. Marshal Curtis Hale hadn't pressed his way in that night, but Silas knew men like him. The Iron Marshal never knocked twice out of courtesy. He circled first, like a wolf, waiting for a slip. A scent of weakness. The Apaches remained hidden in the back room, breathing like hunted animals. Even when the torches disappeared into the storm, no one moved until dawn broke over the prairie. That morning, the land was washed clean, the storm leaving behind a stillness sharp enough to cut. Silas stepped outside, his boots sinking into the damp earth. He leaned on the porch rail, staring at the horizon where Hale's riders had vanished hours earlier. He had lied to the marshal once. He doubted he could do it twice. Behind him, the ranch door creaked. Nakai stepped out, standing tall against the sun. His dark hair was tied back, his posture unbowed, though his eyes carried exhaustion. For a moment, the two men just stood there, strangers bound by circumstance. Finally, Nakai spoke. Marshal will return. Silas glanced at him, one corner of his mouth twisting. He always does. There was a long silence. Then, to his own surprise, Silas muttered, You've brought trouble on me. Nakai's answer came like stone dropped in a still pond. Trouble was already here. You just lived too quiet to see it. Silas bristled. No man, especially not a so-called enemy, had spoken to him like that in years. Yet the words clung to him like burrs. Inside the house, life stirred. Alina was tending to her feverish boy, grinding herbs into a paste. Silas watched her work with quiet efficiency, her hands steady, though her eyes betrayed fear. The child whimpered, and Silas felt an ache rise in his chest. He saw not the boy but the ghost of his own son, fevered one winter long ago, before soldiers and bullets had stolen everything. Without thinking, he stepped forward. Cool his head with cloth soaked in rainwater. The fever will break quicker. Alina looked up, surprised that the hardened rancher offered advice at all. Slowly, she nodded. Thank you. The words were soft, but they pierced deeper than any accusation. Silas turned away, muttering under his breath. But he fetched the water anyway. By midday, the house no longer felt like a battlefield. Silas found himself showing Nakai how to secure the barn doors against the prairie winds, his rough voice explaining each knot. Nakai, in turn, showed him how to read the ground for tracks, how to see what others missed. When Silas bent down to examine faint impressions in the mud, Nakai tapped the edge of his boot against the earth. Cavalry horse. Passed here before sunrise, Silas's stomach clenched. Hale had already doubled back. Later, as Silas patched a hole in the fence, Kohana appeared silently at his side. The young warrior's face was carved with suspicion, his eyes sharp as flint. He spoke in broken English, his words more like accusations than questions. Why you help? You hate us. Silas met his stare, unflinching. I don't hate you. I hate what war makes of men. Kohana's lip curled, but he said no more. He walked away, leaving Silas with the bitter truth echoing in his chest. That evening, Elena found Silas on the porch, staring at the horizon again. The photograph of his wife and boy rested in his lap. She stood quietly for a long time before speaking. They were taken from you. Silas didn't look at her, but his voice cracked when he answered. Not by your people, by the ones wearing blue coats, waving flags, calling it justice. Her eyes softened, though her voice was firm. Then you know our pain. For the first time in years, Silas felt something stir inside him. Not forgiveness, not peace, but recognition. He wasn't alone in his grief. Their wounds mirrored his own. The moment shattered when a rider appeared on the horizon. A single figure, cutting across the prairie with purpose. Silas squinted. His guts sank. Marshal Hale. The Iron Marshal rode slow, deliberate, until his horse stopped at the gate. His cold smile was as sharp as barbed wire. Evening, Kane. Thought I'd check on you. Stormy night to be alone. Unless you ain't alone. His eyes lingered too long on the barn. Silas's hand drifted to his rifle, but his voice stayed steady. Nothing here but cattle. Marshal Hale smirked, tipping his hat. Funny thing about cattle. They don't leave tracks like the ones I found out yonder. The tension snapped taut. Behind the barn wall, Silas knew the Apaches were listening, every breath trembling. Hale leaned forward in his saddle, his voice low and cutting. I'll find out, Kane, and when I do, you'll burn with them. With that, he turned his horse and rode off, leaving dust and dread in his wake. Silas stood frozen, the Apache's eyes on him from the shadows. For the first time, he realized the line between his ghosts and their fight had blurred. His silence would no longer protect him. The sun slid low across the prairie, staining the land in shades of copper and blood. Silas Kane stood on his porch, his rifle leaning against the rail. His hands were steady, but inside his chest, his heart thudded like hooves against hard ground. He didn't have to wait long. A cloud of dust rose on the horizon, moving slow but deliberate. 20 riders, their silhouettes cutting hard against the dying light. Bluecoats, rifles, torches, and at the front, as inevitable as death itself, rode Marshal Hale, the Iron Marshal, sat tall in his saddle, his long coat snapping in the wind. His eyes were sharp, his smile colder than steel. He wasn't here for a friendly check. The Apaches had already been hidden. Nakai and the others crouched in the cellar beneath the barn, every creak of wood above them like thunder. Elena clutched her feverish child close, whispering prayers in her language. Even Kohana, fierce and restless, had gone still as stone. Silas wiped the sweat from his brow and stepped down from the porch as the riders slowed to a stop. Hale swung down from his horse, boots striking the dirt like a judge's gavel. Evening, Kane. Hale's voice carried across the quiet. You've been keeping to yourself, same as always. But word spreads fast when tracks lead straight to your land. Silas stood firm. Storm washed 100 tracks across this prairie. Could have been anyone. Hale's smile widened, but his eyes never softened. Storm washed a lot, sure, but not the kind I follow. Apache tracks, 10 sets, women, children, warriors. Fresh. The soldiers behind him shifted, their rifles angled just enough to be a threat. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Silas forced his jaw to unclench. You're seeing ghosts. Marshal, this ranch don't shelter anyone. Hale stepped closer, boots grinding into the mud. His eyes flicked to the barn, then back to Silas. He leaned in, his voice low and poisonous. You and I both know what happens if you're lying. Harboring Apaches ain't just foolish, it's treason. They'll hang you slow for less. For a heartbeat, neither man moved. Lightning flashed on the horizon, the storm not yet gone. Silas's hand twitched toward his rifle. Hale noticed and smirked. Careful, Kane, you draw on me. You're finished before you breathe. Behind the barn wall, Nakai pressed his hand against the dirt, listening. He could hear every word, every scrape of boot and shift of saddle. Kohana's hand gripped his knife, but Nakai held him back with a silent shake of the head. Hale finally straightened, dusting off his coat. He turned to his men. Search the place. The soldiers dismounted, boots thudding against the wet ground. They split into pairs, moving toward the barn, the house, even the chicken coop. Silas's stomach dropped. If they opened the cellar door, it was over. He stepped forward, planting himself between the soldiers and the barn. His voice cut sharp as a whip. This is private land. You got no right to tear through it without cause. Hale laughed, low and humorless. 'Cause Kane, the only cause I need is my word. Out here, I am the law. The soldiers froze, waiting for Hale's command. The air felt ready to explode. Finally, Hale lifted his hand. Leave it. For now, the soldiers pulled back reluctantly. Hale mounted his horse again, his gaze never leaving Silas. You're walking a dangerous road, Kane. I smell the truth, on this place. Next time I ride out here, if I find so much as a scrap of Apache leather, you and your ghosts will be buried together. With that, he spurred his horse and led the riders back into the fading light. Dust trailing like smoke, the silence after their departure was suffocating. Slowly, the barn cellar door creaked open. Nakai emerged first, his face unreadable, followed by the others. Alina clutched her child, her eyes wide with fear. Silas exhaled, his voice rough. He's not finished. Next time, he won't just talk. Nakai nodded, his gaze burning. Then we fight. Together, Silas looked at him, at the boy shivering in Elena's arms, at Kohana sharpening his knife by the fire. The ghosts of his past pressed close, whispering in the storm's dying wind. For the first time in years, Silas Kane knew he had a choice: stay silent, or stand. The night came heavy, smothering the prairie in a silence too deep to trust. The wind had died, the stars hidden by thick storm clouds. Every creak of the ranch's old boards echoed like thunder in Silas Kane's chest. He knew they were coming. Marshal Hale didn't make threats he didn't plan to keep. Inside the barn, the Apaches prepared in silence. Nakai checked his bow. The sinew pulled tight despite the damp air. Kohana, restless as a caged wolf, slid a knife into his belt and tested the edge with his thumb. Alina huddled with her boy near the hay, whispering stories to keep him from trembling. Silas stood in the doorway, rifle loaded, lantern dimmed. The ghosts of his wife and child seemed to hover in the shadows, urging him, warning him, binding him to the choice he'd already made. A distant sound split the stillness. Hoofbeats, dozens, slow, purposeful. Silas's jaw tightened. They're here. Nakai's dark eyes met his. Then we do not run, we stand. Moments later, torches lit the prairie. The flames swayed in the wind, casting long shadows as Hale's men surrounded the ranch. The marshal himself rode at the front, his pale face half lit by firelight, his grin sharp as a blade. Silas Kane. Hale's voice boomed across the yard. Last chance. Hand him over the women, the child, the warriors. Do that, and I'll let you keep your land and your life. He spread his arms, the torches behind him flaring like wings. And I burn it all to the ground. Silas lifted his rifle, steady as stone. This ranch already burned once. Marshal, won't happen again. The first shot cracked the silence. A soldier fired too early, his bullet tearing through the barn's wall. Nakai answered with an arrow, the shaft flying straight into the man's chest. The soldier toppled, torch tumbling into the mud. Then chaos erupted. Gunfire rattled the night. Torches hissed as arrows cut through them. Soldiers advanced on the barn, only to be met by Silas's rifle barking fire. He moved like a man possessed, each shot clean, precise. His jaw locked against fear. Kohana leaped from the shadows with a cry, knife flashing. He struck down one soldier, then another, before vanishing into the dark like a ghost. The ranch became a battlefield. Smoke and gunpowder thickened the air. Screams tangled with the clash of steel and thunder of hooves. Hale stayed on horseback, barking orders, his revolver gleaming as he fired into the barn. One bullet shattered a lantern inside, flames licking up the hay. Alina cried out, pulling her child away from the sparks. Silas saw it and swore. He burst into the barn, yanking down a burning beam with his bare hands, throwing it into the mud outside. His palms blistered, but he didn't stop. Out the back, he roared to Alina, "Take the boy." She hesitated, her eyes wide, but Nakai shoved her toward the rear door. "Go!" The soldiers closed in. Hale dismounted, his revolver steady as he stalked through the smoke. He fired again, one shot grazing Silas's shoulder, another embedding in the wall beside Nakai's head. Finally, the two men faced each other through the haze. Hale sneered, "You picked the wrong side. Kane, these people will slit your throat the moment you turn your back." Silas raised his rifle, blood dripping from his burned hand. "At least they don't lie about who they are." The standoff broke when Kohana lunged from behind, slashing at Hale's arm. The marshal staggered, dropping his revolver. Nakai moved in, bow drawn, barrow pointed straight at Hale's chest. But Hale laughed, even as blood soaked his sleeve. "Kill me, and every soldier in this territory will ride down on you. You'll damn yourselves and him." He jerked his chin toward Silas. For a moment, the world froze. Nakai's hand trembled on the bowstring. Silas's breath came harsh, his heart hammering. Then Silas stepped forward, rifle still raised. His voice was raw, thunder in the smoke. "You already damned me when you rode onto my land. This ends here." The marshal's smile faltered, just for a second. Behind them, soldiers regrouped, pressing forward with torches. The barn's walls groaned as fire climbed higher. Alina screamed as sparks rained down. And in that instant, before the killing blow could fall, the night split with a sound none expected. A war cry, from the hills beyond the ranch. Dozens of Apache riders thundered into view, painted for battle. weapons gleaming in the firelight.reinforcements.Nakai, single quotes as people had come. The tide of the fight turned in a single heartbeat. Asterisk. The war cries thundered across the prairie like a storm breaking open the heavens. Apache riders swept down from the hills, their painted faces fierce, their horses tearing through the dust. Torches fell from soldiers' hands as panic rippled through Hale's men. For the first time that night, Marshal Hale's smirk faltered. Nakai's bow sang, arrows finding their mark with deadly precision. Kohana rode out of the barn like a shadow unchained, knife flashing, striking fast and vanishing into the smoke. Alina clutched her boy against the fence, shielding his eyes from the carnage, while Silas Kane stood in the center of it, all rifle in his blistered hands, blood dripping from his shoulder, eyes burning with the fire of a man who'd finally chosen his side. The battlefield shifted like a tide. Soldiers broke rank under the fury of the Apache charge, their neat formation collapsing into chaos. Horses reared, men fell, and the prairie echoed with the clash of two worlds. Silas fired again, dropping one soldier who charged toward Alina. His body screamed with exhaustion, but something deeper drove him, something more than vengeance, more than survival. For the first time in years, he wasn't fighting for ghosts. He was fighting for the living. Hale, though, was no coward. Blood dripping from the wound Kohana had given him, he pushed forward, revolver blazing. He cut through the battlefield with simple-minded fury until he reached Silas. The two men stood face to face in the inferno of the burning barn, the screams and gunfire fading into a roar behind them. "This is your end," Kane Hale growled, his revolver raised. "One man against the law. You can't win." Silas's rifle was empty. He dropped it into the mud. His hand hovered near the pistol at his hip, but he didn't draw yet. His voice was steady, every word soaked in grit. "Law," he spat, "you're no law. You're greed dressed in a badge." Hale's grin returned, cruel and sharp. "And you're a fool who forgot which side of the border his blood belongs on." The moment stretched, every heartbeat sharp as glass. Then Hale pulled the trigger. The revolver cracked once, but the bullet never reached. Silas Nakai's arrow split the night, striking Hale's arm and twisting his shot into the dirt. Before Hale could recover, Silas drew and fired. One shot, clean, final. The Iron Marshal staggered back, eyes wide, the smirk wiped from his face for the first and last time. He collapsed in the mud as the barn behind him roared with fire, his badge glinting once before it was swallowed by ashdot. The battlefield went quiet. The soldiers, leaderless and broken, dropped their weapons one by one. The Apache riders circled, war cries fading into silence as they reined in their horses. The prairie, still burning at its edges, held its breath. Silas stood over Hale's body, smoke curling around him. His chest heaved, his hands shook, but his eyes no longer looked hollow. For the first time in years, they burned with life. Nakai stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of both victory and grief. He chose, not for himself, for us. Kohana looked at Silas with grudging respect, his knife dripping in the firelight. Alina, still holding her son, met Silas's gaze with tears on her cheeks, not of fear, but of gratitude. The Apache warriors bowed their heads, a gesture of honor, not submission. Silas felt the ghosts of his wife and child in the wind, not whispering sorrow this time, but silence like they'd finally been laid to rest. He turned to Nakai, his voice rough but certain. "This land, it's more than mine. You need shelter. You have it here, not for one night, for as long as you want it." Nakai's eyes softened. "Then you are no longer alone, Silas Kane." The storm broke with dawn. The prairie glowed gold again, smoke trailing off into the horizon. Soldiers trudged away under guard. Hale's reign of fear ended. The Apaches tended their wounded, their children laughing faintly despite the scars of the night. Silas stood on his porch, watching the sunrise. For years, he had lived in silence, haunted by ashes and memories. Now the ranch was alive, again filled with voices, footsteps, and hope. The loner rancher was no longer alone. And on the wind, carrying across the prairie, the coyote's cry no longer sounded like mourning. It sounded like freedom.